We all understand that a bris milah is really important, but wait until you see how the Rambam contextualizes it. In Soif Hilchos Milah, the Rambam wegen der Meile von Mitzvahs Milah. At the end of the halachas of Milah, the Rambam speaks about the greatness of a bris milah, and he says this: Kol mitzvahs haTorah nichrus alein shalosh brisos. Every other mitzvah of the Torah has 3 covenants associated with it. And he quotes psukim about those covenants in Dvarim. Whereas when Hashem made the covenant of the bris milah with Avraham Avinu, he used the term bris or brisi 13 times. And then the Rambam lists all the 13 references to bris. B's, the last one being Ves brisi okim es Yitzchak, where he says, I'll keep my covenant with Yitzchak. Now, as Mila is Mekoiroi, what's the source that the Rambam calls on? That there are 13 covenants associated with the bris. Kesem Mishnah shows us that it's the Mishnah say Perek Gimel de Nedarim. It's a Mishnah at the end of Perek Gimel of Nedarim, which says, Gedoyla Mila shenichus aleh shloishes brises, that Milah is great because it has 13 covenants associated with it. Now, we're going to see that the Rambam does something a little different to the Mishnah. The Rambam is a Mishnah. He adds information the Mishnah did not include. The first thing is that the Mishnah just said there are 13 brisos associated with Milah. The Rambam specified 13 brisos that were made with Avraham Avinu. And number 2, Beis as Mefaret the other Yud Gimel brisos. Unlike the Mishnah, the Rambam actually lists all 13 of the references to bris. Now, it makes sense. It's not a surprise us that the Rambam expands on the Mishnah, because that's what he's supposed to do. It's normal, as the Rambam tells us in his guide to how his teachings work, that he's going to quote from a Mishnah, and because the Rambam is a book of halachas, is a kamapam mosif from a variable in our Mishnah, he often adds or expounds on the language in the Mishnah, in order that we should have a clear and well-explained halacha. And despite all of that, from there, there are certain things about how the Rambam listed these brisos that need to be explored. First of all, the Makar of Divrei Rambam, let's have a look. Where did the Rambam get his source from? If im Avraham Avinu and if them firit from the Gimel brises, the idea that the covenant was made specifically with Avraham, he obviously doesn't get from the Mishnah in Nedarim. Likewise, listing what the 13 are is also not from the Mishnah in Nedarim. So where did the Rambam find that information? It's Lecha in Yerushalmi in Nedarim. That information would appear to be in the Gemara Yerushalmi in Nedarim also, where the Maimon from Yechmeh, which says, the Torah tells us on that day the Eibishter made a covenant with Avraham Avinu, and then lists various of the quotations till the last one, the same that the Rambam quoted. Now, in that case, we have to understand if it would appear that the Rambam is basing himself on the Yerushalmi, why does he leave out the very first pasuk the Yerushalmi quoted, which was that on that day the Eibishter made a covenant with Avraham Avinu. Especially seeing as that is a pasuk that appears earlier in the parasha, it would make sense to be the first pasuk that you quote. Okay, so by Pashtus, the easiest way to explain this would be the Rambam rechendos Gimel brises in parasha on the pasuk v'yom gomer. The fact that the Rambam lists 13 covenants without that pasuk v'yomahu is actually very simple. Is moving as a halt as that pasuk is nit bichlolam must be because the Rambam believes that pasuk that on that day Hashem made a covenant with Avraham Avinu is not related to bris milah. But why would he say that? Is that the Rambam is mefarish in Pirush HaMishnayis. So have a look at what the Rambam explains in Pirush HaMishnayis, where he says, "V'gimel bris say milas bris u bris yanichpolim b'mitzvah Hashem yisborach le Avraham Avinu b'bris milah." All of these 13 references to either bris or brisi are words that were repeated during the course of the covenant that Hashem made with Avraham Avinu about the bris milah, b'maimad echad bifnei atzmoi, all in one sitting, in one meeting that was independent from other meetings that the Eibishter had with Avraham Avinu. Those are the only ones that the Rambam lists. Now, why would that exclude the pasuk the Yerushalmi brought? Because because that pasuk that the Eibishter made a covenant with Avram, that is referring to a covenant is not a covenant that happened in the same interaction as the ones about bris milah. In fact, there are many years between the two. According to Rashi, there's almost 30 years between the two. According to other Mefarshim, There's 15 years between the two brises. Secondly, and possibly more importantly, is about the bris ben Absarim, not about the bris milah. Right? Now, bris ben Absarim, if Nesinas Haaretz is Zara Shel Avram, this is the covenant that David is giving Eretz Yisrael to Avram's descendants. So that would make sense why the Rambam leaves that one off the list. But that only raises the question in the other direction. Then in that case, why did the Yerushalmi quote that pasuk by Yom Ha'u, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with the bris milah? Nachmer Tmiyah, what also is strange is the Maimon Yerushalmi kom mazbe sein, was the Mishnah sagt, as if Milah nichnas so shleishes brises. The Gemara in Talmud Yerushalmi is explaining the Mishnah, which is the same Mishnah that you have in Bavli, obviously, that said that there are 13 covenants associated with bris milah. And the Yerushalmi even says that. It says 13 covenants. Now, if you're going to include an additional pasuk, then truly it's 14, not 13 covenants. So how do you explain that? So the various commentators offer various suggestions. We'll look at some of them. Aleph, the truth is, some Mefarshim say that pasuk doesn't belong in the Yerushalmi. It must have been a girsa that got somehow corrupted. Not the pasuk of Etne Brisi vid the Rambam rechent. Rather, it should start with, as the Rambam does, the pasuk that says, "I'm going to make a covenant between me and you, and with your descendants, etc." The only problem with that explanation is there are various Rishonim who quote the Yerushalmi, and they quote as the pasuk by Yom Ha'u v'et gerech l'asenu and ersha from Yigim brises. They quote that pasuk by Yom Ha'u as one of, in fact, the first of the 13 brises. So that commentary to say it's the wrong pasuk is a little bit of a stretch. So that then says, how do they explain it? They believe that the Yerushalmi excludes one of the references to bris in the context of bris milah. Then pasuk as brisi hefar, the pasuk that says if a person does not give their child a bris, then they have absolved the covenant with Hashem. Or alternatively, when there's a single pasuk that has the word bris twice, you actually, in this case, the Hakimoy says brisi, you actually only count it as one covenant. Neat. And that would be different, obviously, to the Rambam, who says brisi and bris olam is actually two different brisos, and that would be the discrepancy between the Yerushalmi and the Rambam, but they both come to the conclusion of 13. As the Rambam is mechulek midas Yerushalmi, and of course, according to that commentary, the Rambam and Yerushalmi have a different view of how you're supposed to divide up the different references to bris. Aber. So those explanations would work. That's all very well to suggest that the Rambam has a different view to the Yerushalmi, but then the Rambam would have to have some source for his view, because the Rambam doesn't have the authority to debate against the Yerushalmi. So there'd have to be some kind of original source in Chazal that lists the 13 brisos the way the Rambam does. Seeing as there is no other Maimon Chazal, and the only place where Chazal spell out all of the 13 brisos is in Yerushalmi, the Bavli is Sosim, and is in Mefaret Velchazani de Gimel brisos, because in the Nedarim in Bavli, it doesn't tell us what the 13 are. It just says there are 13 covenants, without spelling them out. Shloimer, as Semechi from Yerushalmi, Shekod Bizman Leha Bavli, Vein Kamakoimoi. And the logical reason for that would be the Talmud Yerushalmi came before the Talmud Bavli, and it's likely that the Talmud Bavli felt we don't have to now spell out what the 13 references are, because you could always look into the Yerushalmi. But the Rebbe says that's a side note for another time. Is Mestaver, what's most logical is, as the Yerushalmi and the Rambam is a snit aplukte beinehem, has to be that the Rambam is not, unlike what some of the commentaries wanted to say, it has to be that the Rambam is not arguing against the Yerushalmi because he has no basis to do so. No, it must be that the Rambam and the Yerushalmi are giving two different perspectives on the same view about the bris. Now, how could that be? It's going to take us a while to unpack this. To get back to this question, we're first going to have to look at how the Rambam addresses the last two halachas, ches and tes, of Hilchas Milah. So the first thing that he says in the first halacha is Mu'usa hi ha'orla, that the orla is disgusting. And it's something that is actually used as a demerit or denigration of the nations of the world. As the pasuk says, that the nations of the world are uncircumcised. On the other hand, how great is Milah? That Avraham Avinu was not considered whole until he had a bris. As the pasuk says, walk with me, in other words, do what I'm telling you to do, which includes having a bris, and then you'll be complete. As the pasuk continues, I'm going to make the covenant with you. Then says the Rambam, any person who ignores or neutralizes this covenant that Avraham Avinu made, and leaves themselves uncircumcised, or tries to undo the bris, even if that person has Torah and good deeds, they lose their portion in the next world. And then he continues. In a separate, independent halacha, he says, look how serious bris milah is. Moshe Rabbeinu was not excused from the bris milah even for his son, even for a short period of time. And he almost died over it. Even though he was traveling, and travel is an excuse not to do a bris on your son. And then he adds, every other mitzvah in the Torah is made with 3 covenants, whereas Milah has 13, as we said at the beginning of the Sikha. So the Makora Pratim from the Beda halachas is the Zalman Mishnah in Nedarim. All of this information that the Rambam includes in 2 separate halachas all originates in a single Mishnah, in Nedarim. The Rambam is Meshanidim Seder. Now, once we examine this and read the full Mishnah, we'll see that the Rambam changes the order in which things are presented from how they're presented in the Mishnah and leaves certain of them out and changes some of the information. In the Mishnah is after the Mishnah says that the orla is disgusting, then the Mishnah makes the following statements and in this order. First, you have Rabbi Shmuel that there are 13 brises associated with Milah, and therefore it's greater than other mitzvahs. Then Rabbi Yosef the Milah is so important that it overrides Shabbos, which is a very serious mitzvah. The Rambam doesn't mention that. Then you have the comment that the Rambam does include, that Milah is so important or serious that the Eibusha didn't even give any wiggle room to Moshe Rabbeinu. Then Rabbi Nechemia says the Milah is so important that you can even do Milah if there's tsaras in that part of the body, and normally you're not allowed to cut off tsaras. The Rambam doesn't mention this. Rabbi says that similar but not the same as how the Rambam says it, that look how great bris milah is, because Avraham Avinu is not considered complete until he had a bris, and quotes the same pasuk the Rambam did. So the Rambam bringt on nicht die 2 Maimorim as g'dayna milah was is deiches haShabbos and deichen negoim. Interestingly, the Rambam completely leaves out the idea that what makes milah so great. Look, it overrides Shabbos and even tzaras. Kemen sagen, as is sich semech if dem was schein frier in Hilchas Milah gebracht la halacha. So you could say there's a good reason for that, because the Rambam's already dealt with these earlier on in Hilchas Milah. Milah bismana deiches haShabbos, where he told us that if a bris is on time, it overrides Shabbos. Or beim bismana shloi bismana deiches tzaras, and regardless whether the bris is on time or not, it overrides the prohibition against cutting off a symptom of tzaras. Okay, fine. So that explains why it doesn't quote those 2. But what we do have to understand is, why does the Rambam quote these statements in a different order to his source, the Mishnah? How come the first thing that he quotes, straight after telling us that Orla is disgusting, he quotes the last quote from the Mishnah, that Avraham Avinu was only considered complete when he had a bris. Then the Rambam quotes what appears to be independent of this conversation, because it's from a different source in Pirkei Avos. And any person who cancels the bris doesn't have a portion in the next world. And only after that, he puts in a separate halacha, and we know whenever the Rambam writes something in a separate halacha, it's intentional. means it's a different topic. Back to our Mishnah, that the Eibishter didn't tolerate Moshe not giving his son a bris even for a short period of time, and then eventually at the end, what does he quote? The Mishnah, the first thing the Mishnah said. That what's so special about a bris milah, it's associated with 13 covenants. What a strange way to present things. So the simplest thing we have to first consider is the order in which the Rambam presents these Maimorim is must be that he's grouped them according to the theme that the different commentaries or the comments actually all express. And essentially the fact that the Rambam is divided into two halachas tells us that the Rambam is identifying two key specialties about the bris milah. That's why he splits them into two halachas. In the halacha ches, the first of the two halachas, which is halacha ches, he's talking about the elements of the bris milah as they are relevant relative to the person having the bris. So there's something negative you have to know and something positive you have to know. And the sugas kedel der shlile das was musi Allah shin is gana bahagoyim. So first you have to know the negative, which is having orla is disgusting. It's considered one of the reasons that the goyim are considered, in a sense, denigrated. And then there's something positive. The person is disgusting if they don't have a bris. The person becomes complete if they do have a bris. And that's why in that context of what happens to the person when they do or don't have a bris, in that context he says, the Maimer from Masech Avos can make for bris some gavra that if the person doesn't have a bris, they as a person lose their portion in the world to come. That's halacha ches. In the tzveit halacha tes, the next halacha, which is the ninth halacha. Now the Rambam is no longer talking about the impact of the bris on the person. It's talking about the bris as a concept, the bris as a mitzvah. Und der Pfarrer bringt it down to my Morich Chazal. So now he quotes those parts of the Mishnah that spoke about the greatness of the mitzvah. There's a negative element. Look how little the Eibishter will tolerate a person delaying a bris because it's such an important mitzvah. Even Moshe Rabbeinu did not get any spare time. And on kol mitzvah satayr nichsalen gimel brises chulei v'alamin nichusu yud gimel brises im Avram Avinu anyin and chiyuv. And then he tells us the positive. Every other mitzvah is associated with 3 covenants, and this is associated with 13. Okay, so now we get it. The Rambam is speaking about 2 elements of bris. Things are starting to fall into place. However, the language difference between how the Rambam says things and the Mishnah says things still should catch our attention. Somebody verständig doesn't make sense. Was der Rambam is Mishana, 2 key things that the Rambam changes. Aleph, in the Mishnah is the Lashon Gedoyla Mila by Beide Inyonim. The Mishnah was consistent in both conversations. It spoke about how great the bris is. Gedoyla Mila Shenich Soleyu Gimel Brises. Bris Mila is great, therefore there's 13 covenants. Gedoyla Mila Shenich Moshe Chulei, and Mila is great, therefore Moshe wasn't given any leeway. The Rambam, on the other hand, in the Erst Halacha Zakil L'Sheina Mishnah, in the first Halacha, he uses the same language as the Mishnah. Look how great Bris Milah is. Great, same word as the Mishnah. Avram Avinu is not considered complete until he has a bris. So in the second Halacha, however, he does not use the same language as the Mishnah, how great the bris is. Instead, he says, look how severe bris milah is, that there was no leeway for Moshe. And then, intriguingly, he continues with a conjunction, with an and. So he says, look how serious bris is. That makes sense. It's serious. Moshe is given no leeway. But then under the banner of serious, he says, then he says, and all other mitzvahs only have 3 covenants, and the bris has 13, and that's under the word chamura. If bris is because it's a severe mitzvah, therefore there are 13 covenants. How does that square up? Second question. In the Mishnah, it said the milah is great because it has 13 covenants. Without comparing it to other mitzvahs, it just said milah is great, it's got 13 covenants. The comparison between 13 covenants by bris and 3 by other mitzvahs is in a totally different masechta in brachas. There, the Gemara says that you have to prioritize a bris before Torah study because this is 13 and that has 3 covenants. How does the Rambam get it into his halacha over here? And thirdly, Gimel, the Rambam brings us nicht mit dem Lashon al derech lishen Gemara kol Torah kula nichus aleh nicht mit Gimel brises. The Rambam also uses different language to the Gemara, which said the Torah is associated with 3 covenants and Milah with 13. Rather, and by the way, that's Kilushoni free in Nichas Brachas, when I bring the Maimer Hanal in Brachas. The Rambam had already quoted that Gemara Brachas when he was going through the halachas of Brachas, and there he said that the Torah has 3 brisos, but here, Noras are called mitzvahs HaTorah Nichus Aleh and Chulei. The mitzvahs of Torah have 3 as opposed to 13 brisos. Why does he do that? Now, once we get these pieces of the puzzle together, we'll be able to go back to our original questions. Shlema Abirin, then the explanation is, in Bris Milah Zani Dot Tzvei Inyonim. The Bris Milah has 2 components to it. Aleph Din and Kloli Fun Bris. There's the overarching concept that there's a covenant between us and Hashem, that there's obviously a closeness between us that is established by this covenant. And then Beis, Bris als Mitzvah Pratis. Then there is a mitzvah, one of the 613 mitzvahs, to give a bris. The Rebbe is going to give 2 examples to illustrate the difference between the general theme and the specific mitzvah. We find this in various mitzvahs. Like I said, the Rebbe is going to mention 2. The first is davening. There's the fact that you have to serve the Eibishter, and you do so through davening. Which we learn from the Pesukim that say you have to serve Hashem with all your heart. You have to serve Hashem. The Rambam tells us that is one of these overarching mitzvahs of Torah, that we have to serve Hashem. It's not tethered to a specific behavior initially. And then there's the specific mitzvah that falls under the category of serving Hashem, which is, say, the words of davening. That's why the Rambam includes davening as one of the 613 mitzvahs, even though the Rambam himself says that what doesn't belong on the list of 613 are general overarching mitzvahs, which he's just said davening is one of them. So the Rambam says, how does tefillah land up being on the list of 613 mitzvahs? Because besides the overarching theme that you have to serve Hashem, there's the specific mitzvah that you have to daven, and davening is a particular formula. Second example, the same is with tshuva. It says, there's the overarching principle of tshuva, which is to regret what we did wrong in the past and to make good resolution for the future. That is an overarching principle in Judaism. And it's linked directly to the overarching principle of accepting Hashem's authority, which is why it is not on the list of 613 mitzvahs, do tshuva. And then within tshuva, on faran, in prati from tshuva, there's the detail of how you do tshuva practically, which includes verbal confession, which the Rambam does list as one of the 613 mitzvahs. Uns ist verstandig, you can understand as by Mekayim sein die Inen miyuchot von Tefillah bedibur oder tshuva bevidoi dvarim. So now it makes sense. When you actually physically say the words of davening, or you actually have make the confession of tshuva, needless to say, you're not only getting the mitzvah of words of davening, you're getting the mitzvah of davening. You're not only getting the mitzvah of confession, you're getting the mitzvah of tshuva, which incorporates and envelops the whole of Torah. So the same principle applies, but on a grander scale to bris milah. Mitzvah pratis. It is a specific mitzvah. Eine von die Tarig mitzvahs, one of the 630. But bris milah is aber in kloli. At the same time, the bris is a very broad, overarching principle in Judaism. Bris von Eden it's a covenant between the entirety of the person and the entire anatomy of the person, mit Neibishim, with Hashem. Signa Nacher says the bris similar to how the Alter Rebbe describes it in Tanya, that when a person has a bris, that completes the process of turning the person into a Jewish holy individual. You You actually see this alluded to in two aspects of the bris milah of a convert to Judaism. The Inyan klali for milah, als geder von geirus. So generically, having a bris is that transfer from being a non-Jewish person to becoming a Jewish person. Now the person becomes a holy Jew. Or milah kimitz pratis for milah, and at the same time he's fulfilling one of the 613 mitzvahs. While this is transforming his entire being, he's fulfilling one of the 613 mitzvahs to have a bris. But the Ragachava goes into a lot of detail about this, and in a similar way, every single one of us, we have a covenant with the Eibishter that is then solidified by the action of the bris. Now we can understand why the Rambam splits these things into two halachas, not only because it's the gavra and the chefza, the person having the bris, and the essence of the mitzvah, but he's speaking about the first halacha is talking about the general principle of covenant between person and God. Then klolis we can take it from bris milah, which is the theme of the bris. And how the bris affects the person, that the person now becomes a holy Jew. And the zweite halacha is the meduba wegen der mitzvah pratis to get the pratis from bris milah. The second halacha is talking about all the details that are about the mechanics of the mitzvah itself, the physical mitzvah that you do. That's why in the first halacha the Rambam says that the orla is disgusting, and it's one of the reasons for deprecating the nations of the world. As the pasuk emphasizes, the nature of non-Jewish people is arelim. It's not just telling us that the physical piece of anatomy is disgusting. It is the symbol of distinction between the Jewish nation and other nations. As always, that dafka being uncircumcised is a non-Jewish attitude. And for a Yid, having the bris, that makes the person Jewish. That makes the bond between them and Hashem. Und das ist musbar in dem, was der Rambam sagt nach dem, that is reflected in the words that the Rambam chooses. Gedoylo hi ha-milah. Milah is great. Shelo nikra Avraham Avinu Shalom. Ad Shemo. Avraham Avinu, the great Avraham Avinu, is not considered a complete person until he has a bris. Shenemei salich l'fonai be'yatom v'etnem bris ben v'necho goyim, and then quotes the psukim. In other words, what's he telling us in the first part? The shleimus von Yisrael, the bris mit den Eibishter is durch milah dafka. What makes a Jew a complete Jew is the covenant between that Jew and Hashem. That covenant is achieved through the bris milah. Und der Rebbe is the Rambam mamshich in der Halacha und bringt Maimon Masechta Avos. That's why the Rambam inserts into that conversation from a different source in Pirkei Avos. Kol ha'meifir bris shel Avraham Avinu chulei. That if a person ignores the bris, even though he has Torah Ma'asim Tevim, he's not a full Jew. Doesn't have a portion in Olam Haba. Which shows us in a very clear way how much the bris milah determines the holiness, or God forbid, lack thereof, of a Jewish person. In the zweite halacha redet der Rambam als mitzvah pratis, whereas in the second halacha he's talking about the bris milah as one of the 613 mitzvahs governed by the laws, like any other mitzvahs governed by laws. As I feel of mitzvah pratis, so now you're comparing this mitzvah to the other 612 mitzvahs. Says the Rambam, guess what? This mitzvah has something that the other 612 don't have. That's why straight away the Rambam uses different language to the Mishnah, because he's trying to emphasize something different, which is look how serious bris milah is. Not how great it is. As he said in the previous halacha, and as the Mishnah did, because Gedolah Milah is talking about the greatness that it affects us. But here he's talking about the severity of the bris, or of the person who doesn't have a bris. Milah mitzvah pratis, looking at bris milah as a mitzvah amongst mitzvahs. On the roof pastel loshen chamura, that's why you could use the word severity, because you're comparing one mitzvah to another. And to illustrate that, he brings 2 points. Number one, on the negative side, that Moshe Rabbeinu was not given any leeway when he delayed a bris for his son, even though he was traveling. Which shows you how serious this mitzvah is. Many other mitzvahs are suspended under difficult circumstances. And then, and that's why he uses the Vav HaMosif And here's another illustration of how you see that this mitzvah is something far more powerful, far greater than the other mitzvahs. You see, he says all other mitzvahs of Torah, because he's comparing mitzvahs to mitzvahs, only have 3 covenants associated with them. This one has 13. So he's not comparing bris milah to the whole of Judas and the whole of Torah. Specifically, he's comparing this individual mitzvah to the other individual mitzvahs. By telling us that every other mitzvah is associated with 3 covenants, and this is associated with 13 covenants. Now let's compare that back to the Mishnah in Nedarim, which said that the milah is great because it's associated with 13 covenants. Al derech gadol shekel b'cham mekemes lefi inyonei b'shonim b'chochma b'yoshamayim b'anokim biz al derech gadol havaya. Greatness is a relative state. Greatness in number, in years. Somebody's older than somebody else. Somebody's wiser than somebody else. Greater Yerushalayim than somebody else, etc. Here, the Rambam the Mishnah is talking about the general concept of milah. V'milah is inyan kloli gans Torah mitzvahs. That just like you could have an element of a person in the community who is the gadol, the great person in the community, this is a mitzvah. It's a great mitzvah in the whole of Judaism. And how do you see this greatness? It's associated with 13 covenants, as opposed to everything else. Every other part of Torah only has 3 brises. With all of this information, we can go back and understand why the Rambam and the Yerushalmi are coming from different perspectives without actually arguing. Reminding ourselves that the Rambam did not quote the first pasuk the Yerushalmi brings, which is that on that day Hashem made a covenant with the Jewish people. Despite the fact that Yerushalmi did bring that pasuk. Why? Because the Yerushalmi and the Rambam are coming from totally different perspectives. In Yerushalmi, the Yerushalmi, remember, is a Gemara, which means it's explaining the Mishnah. And the Mishnah said, that milah is great, because it has 13 covenants. In other words, the Mishnah there, which the Gemara is commenting on, is speaking about bris milah generically, as a great principle or a great relationship between us and Hashem. Which is the greatness of us being Jewish people who are holy. If you're speaking about our greatness, our unique bond with Hashem, that pasuk from the Bris Ben Absarim is relevant to that message. How so? The Asborin, the explanation is, even though the practical way that we manifest the covenant we have with Hashem is through the specific action of a bris. By having a physical bris on the body, similar to how do you do avodas Hashem, you daven. How do you do tshuva? You make a vidoy. Is the bris qualified by Yadid and Oichin Fall when a hot to leave as if Alpitero need Kekemakaim Samitzvus Mila before Yal. But what's unique about the bris milah is that this covenant and connection and bond with Eibush exists for a Jewish person, even if the Torah allows them not to or requires them not to have a bris for health reasons, etc. The Mishnah is in Nedarim, like the Mishnah in Nedarim says, the Mishnah says, interesting, if a person says that they make an oath that they will not have any benefit from a person who is uncircumcised, mutar bar Yisrael, he's permitted to have benefit from a Jewish person who hasn't had a bris, even though technically he's uncircumcised. Ve'osur b'mulei akum, and a non-Jewish person who is circumcised is not permitted to have benefit from them. Why? Because the term circumcised is a term to describe a Jewish person. And if he says, I'm not going to have benefit from people who are circumcised, he's not allowed to benefit from a Jewish person who hasn't had a bris. And he is permitted to have benefit from a non-Jewish person who is circumcised. Because the term orla is a term used to define non-Jewish people, as the pasuk says. Whereas the Jewish people, the orla that we have embedded, so to speak, within us is on the heart rather than physical. Umutam bozef avos the Mishnah bring them maim al sakdom to divide the Gemara Amorim meusi hi ha'or lechulei gdoilei ha'milish nichas alei chulei, and that would explain why the Mishnah brought that quotation first, unlike the Rambam who brought that one last. Before it gets into the fact that Orle is disgusting and that Mila is great. Leram as the bris kloli is better faran by Yedin Eden, because the Mishnah wants us to know that the bond and covenant between us and Hashem is fundamental. It's there for every single Jew. From bris mila b'fsarchem. Sorry, or no, the gemar hadavar. But what culminates, what concludes the process, b'foil of a giloi in a practical and revealed way, from bris mila b'fsarchem, by actually physically having a bris. Shlem the tam der fun, and the reason is is given by Meshnin Avram Avinu, because that's how it was by Avram Avinu, the first Jew. The bris kloli zwischen Meshnin Avram Avinu is nicht given bis man und durch bris mila. The general covenant between him and the Eibishter was not at the time of or through the process of the bris mila. Nasach Yoram Fardim was many years earlier. Bris ben Absarim and the bris ben Absarim with Koras Hashem as Avram bris Leima Gomer, where the Eibishter made a covenant with Avram Avinu, as the Yerushalmi quotes. And also given bris mit Avram v'Zara Achrav. That was a covenant between Avram Avinu and all of his descendants. Now the Noach kama v'chan mishonim lachrei zeh. It's just that many years later is given the tzivui from Eibush and Avram on ot dem bris tafen keveya as ot dem bris tafen keveya and b'fsachem durch mitzvus mila. Decades later, the Eibush just said, now we're going to manifest this covenant in a practical way by having a bris. Und der Fall ist as Zay Bazaya Achrav, and so the same thing applies to us. The bris kloli zwischen Eden and the Meibishn is allemal kayim gleich geschenot. The covenant between us and Hashem is always there from the moment you're born. Even if chas v'shalom a person lost older brothers to bris milah and therefore is not permitted to have a bris, gleich geborn is a kedushas Yisrael. The fact that the person is born Jewish, they're Jewish. They have the holiness of being Jewish. Bris or no bris. Bis es verstandig, als die Gimel Brisses, was der Rambam rechnen da ist, es seine Bezeichnung dieselbe wie die Gimel Brisses, welche werden gerechnet in Yerushalmi. That's why the 13 brisses that the Rambam is quoting are the same 13 brisses Yerushalmi quotes. Not the Yerushalmi is makdim, it's just that the Yerushalmi first gives the introduction to the concept of bris, that it reflects a covenant between us and Hashem, which is there, which is implicit, regardless. And that's an introduction. Then the Yerushalmi doesn't go into the numbers game of exactly how many are in the pasuk. The pasuk Vayemahu Koras Hashem es Avram bris Leima Gomer. The Yerushalmi quotes the pasuk that Hashem made a covenant with Avram Avinu. Valaret free wegen milas bris kloli, because first he wants to speak generically. Das says vidas was nichas alle Gimel brises is madgish as milas a bris kloli zwischen Eden mit Neibishten. First, the Yerushalmi wants us to know that a bris milah is a reflection of a great bris, an intrinsic bris between us and Hashem. The Rebbe brings the al-sakdomelas in the pasuk of serving the bris klali. That's why the Yerushalmi first speaks in the general term that there is a bris klali between us and Hashem. Der Rambam aber kommt in der zweite Halacha sagen, also ich milas mitzvah pratis chamur von kol mitzvah terkenal. But by the time the Rambam gets to listing the 13 brisos, he is not speaking about an overarching relationship that we have with Hashem. He's talking about how powerful, great, and severe the mitzvah of milah is. The Rebbe hat da nicht genau the pasuk by Yom Koras Hashem es Avram bris Leima. Therefore, that pasuk that speaks about a general bris between Hashem and Avram Avinu has no place over here. Was redt wegen dem bris klali, hagam sich das fran in milah, even though that is part of the bris milah, it's no part of the mitzvah milah. Now, fangt on from pasuk vet bris bis zum pasuk ves bris Yaakov es Yitzchak. Rather, the Rambam chooses to focus on the psukim that speak about the actual process of the bris milah, which were all Yigimel brisos will say ala nemra b'maimed echad, which were 13 covenants all made at one time at the time of the actual bris itself, and again the bris prati kanal when the actual bris was done. So we can take comfort in the fact that every single yid has a bris with the Eibishter regardless, and the way that we functionally apply that bris is through the physical action of the bris milah.